The file was thin. That was the first thing Steve Murphy noticed when his supervisor slid it across the desk in the Miami field office in the spring of 1991. 23 pages. A photograph clipped to the inside cover. A heavy-set Colombian man in his early 40s, dark hair, mustache, the kind of face that would disappear in any crowd in any city in the world. A name typed beneath it, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. A case number, a list of known associates that ran to 2 pages and stopped. Murphy looked at the photograph for a moment, then set the file down. "This is it?" he asked. His supervisor told him that was it. Medellín, full relocation, open-ended assignment. The Colombian National Police would provide support. The embassy had a liaison. There was a budget, modest but functional. Murphy would have a partner, Javier Peña, who had already been in country for 8 months and knew the terrain. "How long do you think it takes?" Murphy asked. His supervisor looked at him the way experienced men look at questions they have stopped answering. "Get down there," he said. "Then tell me." Murphy was 34 years old. He had worked narcotics for 11 years, starting in West Virginia, moving through Florida, accumulating the particular knowledge that comes from a decade of watching how criminal organizations breathe, how they expand when unchallenged, how they contract under pressure, how they always eventually made a mistake that could be followed. He was good at this work. He knew he was good at it, and he did not consider that arrogance. He considered it assessment. He landed in Bogotá on a Tuesday in April with 2 suitcases and a Spanish that was functional but not fluent. By Thursday, he was in Medellín. By Friday evening, he was sitting across from Javier Peña in a small restaurant near the safe house they had been given, eating something he didn't recognize and listening to the city outside. Medellín in 1991 was a city that moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. On the surface, in its cafes, its markets, its crowded buses navigating steep hillside roads, it moved with the ordinary energy of any Colombian city of 2 million people. Beneath that surface, at a frequency most visitors never tuned into, it moved with the specific tension of a place that had learned to live alongside something it could not see directly but could always feel. "What's he like?" Murphy asked Peña that first evening. "In person. You've talked to people who've been in the room with him?" Peña considered this for a moment. He was a few years older than Murphy, quieter, more accustomed to the particular patience this work required down here. "Everyone says the same thing," Peña said. "They say he seems normal. That's the word they always use. Normal." Murphy filed this away without fully understanding it. Normal was not the word he had expected. The first 8 months taught him the geography of the problem. Escobar's operation was not structured the way Murphy had been trained to think about criminal organizations. There was no clean hierarchy, no org chart that, once identified, could be dismantled from the top down. It was something closer to a climate, pervasive, ambient, present in everything without being locatable in any single place. Men who worked for Escobar often didn't know they worked for Escobar. Money moved through layers of legitimate business that had been built over years, each layer insulated from the one below it. Informants who seemed reliable turned out to be managed, their information calibrated to reveal just enough to appear useful while concealing everything that mattered. Murphy learned to read the city differently. He learned which neighborhoods the police entered and which they didn't. He learned the particular silence that descended on a street when a convoy of black SUVs passed. Not fear exactly, but a specific quality of attention, a collective holding of breath that lasted until the vehicles were gone. He learned that certain people would speak to him freely about anything except the one subject he needed, and that this was not coincidence. He sent reports back to Miami. Progress, measured in the accumulation of partial pictures, associates identified, safe houses located and watched, financial trails traced to the 3rd or 4th layer, before they disappeared into structures too opaque to penetrate quickly. His supervisor responded with patience that Murphy suspected was not fully genuine. He did not feel defeated. He felt the way a man feels when a problem is taking longer than expected, but is still, clearly, solvable. He adjusted his timeline. He kept working. Then in December of 1991, an informant named Carlos stopped returning calls. Carlos was not his real name. Murphy never learned his real name, and by the time he understood why that was significant, it no longer mattered. He had been introduced to Murphy through a Colombian police contact 6 months earlier. He was a mid-level figure, not someone inside Escobar's inner circle, but someone who moved in adjacent spaces, who heard things, who had, as far as Murphy could determine, genuine reasons to cooperate. He had provided 17 pieces of information over 6 months. 14 had checked out. 3 had been impossible to verify either way. Murphy had considered him reliable. When Carlos stopped returning calls, Murphy's first assumption was operational caution. A temporary withdrawal, something had spooked him. He would resurface. This happened. It was part of the texture of this work, the disappearances and reappearances, the silences that turned out to mean nothing. After 2 weeks, he asked his Colombian police contact to make inquiries. The contact called back 3 days later. His voice, when he spoke, had a quality Murphy would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately. Not grief, not fear, but something adjacent to both. A flatness that communicated the end of something. Carlos had been found. He would not be resurfacing. Murphy thanked the contact and ended the call and sat in the safe house for a long time without moving. He had lost informants before. It was in the brutal arithmetic of this work an anticipated variable. Men who operated in these spaces accepted certain risks, and Murphy accepted on their behalf a responsibility he carried quietly and carefully. He knew how to process loss without allowing it to distort his judgment. But something about this particular loss was different, and it took him several days to understand what it was. It was not that Carlos had died, it was the specific timing of it, and the specific manner, which the contact had described in 2 sentences, quietly, as though the details were too precise to linger on. And most of all, the fact that in 17 pieces of information provided over 6 months, Carlos had never once mentioned anything that had endangered his own position. He had been useful, he had been careful, and he had been found anyway. Murphy pulled out the 17 pieces of information and went through them again, slowly, looking for the thread he had missed. He found nothing. There was no leak he could identify, no single disclosure that had been the cause, which meant one of 2 things. Either the source of the compromise was somewhere he couldn't see, inside the police structure or the embassy or his own operation, or Carlos had been found through a method that had nothing to do with what Carlos had said. The second possibility was the one Murphy kept returning to. It meant that Escobar had not been reacting to information. He had been watching the shape of things. Who was moving? Who was meeting whom? What patterns of behavior had shifted? And he had identified Carlos not through any specific disclosure, but through the reading of an invisible structure that Murphy had not known was visible. Murphy sat with this for a long time. He had been trained to find patterns. He had spent 11 years learning to read the evidence that criminal organizations leave, the trails of behavior and money and association that accumulate into something mappable. He was good at it. He believed in it. But what he was looking at now was something that inverted that skill entirely. Escobar was not leaving trails for Murphy to follow. Escobar was reading Murphy's trails. He was watching the investigation the way a man watches a room he cannot enter. Through the gaps, through the movement of people around its edges, through the slight disturbances that a presence creates even when that presence believes itself invisible. It was the first time Murphy felt the actual weight of what he was looking at. Not the violence, not the scale of the organization, not the money or the political reach, all of which he had understood intellectually from the moment he opened that thin file in Miami, but the specific quality of mind behind it, the patience, the peripheral vision, the ability to see a structure from outside it and understand what it meant. He rewrote his assessment that night, not his official report. That would come later in more careful language. His private assessment, the one he kept in a notebook that never left his person. He crossed out the word manageable, which he had written in the first week after arriving in Medellín. He did not replace it with anything. The hunt continued for 2 more years. Murphy worked it the way you work a problem that has revealed itself to be larger than the tools you brought to solve it. Methodically, without the comfort of confidence, accumulating what could be accumulated, and accepting that the final step would require something that could not be planned for in advance. He developed new protocols. He compartmentalized differently. He changed the shape of his own movements, the patterns of his days, the routes he took to meetings. He became, in small ways, harder to read. He did not know if it helped. He suspected Escobar noticed the adjustment and filed it away somewhere. The way a man notices that a chess opponent has changed their opening and recalibrates accordingly. Peña noticed the change in him. They didn't discuss it directly. That was not how they worked, the two of them. They communicated mostly in the shorthand of men who had spent enough time in the same rooms that full sentences were often unnecessary. But one evening, sitting on the roof of the safe house while the city settled into its nighttime frequencies below them, Peña said, "You look like you stopped expecting it to be easy." Murphy thought about that for a moment. "I stopped expecting it to be what I thought it was," he said. Peña nodded and didn't ask him to clarify. "The thing you came down here thinking you were hunting turned out to be something you had not had the right vocabulary for before you arrived. And the process of acquiring that vocabulary, of learning to see what you were actually looking at, was not comfortable. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened in the accumulation of small corrections, each one quiet, each one slightly costly." He thought about Carlos less often as time passed, but he did not stop thinking about him entirely. On the 2nd of December, 1993, in a residential neighborhood of Medellín called Los Olivos, Pablo Escobar was located and killed. Murphy was part of the operation. He was present in the hours that followed, moving through rooms that smelled of the ordinary details of a life in hiding. Food, clothing, the residue of days spent in a particular small space. He did not feel triumph. He had expected to. For 3 years, the anticipation of this moment had operated as a kind of background frequency, something that sustained the work when the work was unsustaining. But standing in that house in Los Olivos, he felt something more complicated and less satisfying than triumph. He felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years running towards something and arrived at it and found it smaller than the shadow it had cast. In 2012, Murphy served as a consultant and on-screen narrator for the documentary series that would eventually become the foundation for a broader television project. He gave dozens of interviews during that period, many of which ran longer than the cameras required. The excess footage left on cutting room floors or archived in production offices. In one of those sessions, a 2-hour conversation recorded in a production office in Los Angeles, most of which was never broadcast, the interviewer asked Murphy when he first understood what he was actually dealing with. Murphy was quiet for a moment. "There was a man," he said, "an informant. I won't use his name. He was reliable, careful. He knew the rules. And one day he was gone, and when I tried to understand why, when I went back through everything he had told us and looked for the mistake, there was no mistake. There was no leak. There was no single thing that had given him away." "What did that tell you?" Murphy looked at the table between them for a moment before answering. "It told me that Escobar wasn't watching what we found," Murphy said. "He was watching how we looked, the shape of it, who moved, who stopped moving, what changed. He was reading the investigation the way you'd read a room you weren't in, through the vibrations it sent out through the walls." A pause. "I had been thinking about him as a target. That was my error. He was never operating as a target. He was always operating as an observer." The interviewer asked how that realization had changed the work. "It made it longer," Murphy said, "and it made me more careful. And it meant that when we finally got there, when it was over, I wasn't surprised that it had taken as long as it did." He stopped. "I was surprised by something else." "What?" Murphy considered the question for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how precisely to say something he has thought about many times. "I was surprised," he said finally, "by how long it took me to stop checking the perimeter. Old habit, looking for the shape of a presence I'd spent 3 years trying to locate." He paused again. "Some things take a while to understand that they're finished." The camera kept rolling. Murphy didn't add anything to that. He didn't need to.